Hi everybody, thanks for coming. There's a seat here if anybody wants one. There's a seat here if anybody wants one, so you'll be a bit more involved in the conversation than you might like to be. So this is generally going to be a discussion, and it's just going to raise a few questions, and as with a lot of things like this, there probably won't be any massive action points at the end of it other than agreed principles. So I'm Mark Hannell, I do Figshare. It's a platform where researchers can make all of their academic outputs available in a citable, shareable, discoverable manner. Google it, you'll see more about it on the About page. And joining me, we have Sarah Callahan, who's from the British Atmospheric Data Centre, where she's been working on data reuse and encouraging academics to reuse the data and make the data available and share it and what have you. On the end, we've got Ross Mounts, who's a University of Bath PhD student studying fossils and phylogeny. He's also a Panton Fellow, so he's very involved in the Open Knowledge Foundation and open data in general. So the session title is Data Reuse, which obviously is kind of a it's in the simplest sense the same way that every time somebody cites your research, that's somebody saying I've used your research. But what they're not saying is I've used your data. And this is something that we're going to be talking about. This is my one slide, which is academics where share data. So just a quick show of hands so we know who we're talking to. Who here is an academic? Or was an academic? So that's most people. Publishers? Also most people. Funders?
Give it up to funders.
Yeah. Anybody not put their hand up yet?
Members of the librarians.
Anybody else still not covered? Okay, so we generally know you can replace that academics with all of these other words that we just used. And so, yeah, we're just going to have a quick what our interests are in this. We've got some points about that we'd like to have the conversation around. Please feel free to raise any questions at any point and interrupt and shout if you don't agree with us. So, for those who don't know what Figshare is, I did a PhD in stem cell biology, and the story I always use is that I generated 9 gigabytes of data during my PhD, of which, as of right now, you as a community can access my 3 papers that I've published, each of which have 5 static images in, which isn't really a true reflection of the 9 gigabytes of data that I generated. And so I wanted to make somewhere where you could just upload your data simply, where data sets, videos, presentations, anything, you can upload it onto Figshare and get a DOI. And that is my in to this session. So I'll let the other two introduce themselves a bit better than I did.
Thanks. Okay, so before I start talking, hands up anyone who was at the Story Collider event last night. Right, so you've already got a really good idea of why I got into this whole data sharing malarkey if you were there. For those who haven't, suffice it to say, I spent far too much of my early career as a scientist lovingly handcrafting a data set, which I've just managed to get published 8 years after it was finally finished. Go me. So I work for the British Atmospheric Data Centre, and it's one of a federation of data centres which is funded by NERC to manage and curate all the environmental data sets that are created in the course of NERC's activities funding environmental data research. We cover things like atmospheric science, Earth observation data, hydrology, oceanography, ecology, hydrology, anyway, polar science. If it's anything to do with the Earth, then we pretty much have it covered. We even do have one data set, which is the atmosphere on Mars, which is pretty cool as well. So of course, we want to encourage the researchers to actually give us their data in the first place, so we can look after it properly. And we want to do this, and we want to encourage the researchers to do this, and we need to make sure that the benefits of them doing this is clearly communicated to them. One, what's in it for a researcher who creates a data set? Why should they put it in our archives? Why should they share it with other people? Why should they make it available for reuse? And the reason is, as far as our funders are concerned, is that it's very expensive to collect data in the first place. And also, we are in the situation of, we don't have a time machine. We can't nip back to last Tuesday to make a measurement that we missed. So the data that we've got, that we've recorded in the past, is all that we've got. So we need to look after it properly. We're also in the situation of an awful lot of our data holdings are weather-related data, and weather is useful not only to meteorologists, but to a surprisingly wide range of people that you wouldn't think about at first glance. I believe we have a case study of one of our data sets being accessed by someone who is studying newt populations in a pond somewhere in West Wales or something like that. And you wouldn't think newt weather, but then if you think about it, it makes sense. Anyway, I've wished on enough. Over to you.
So when I first started out my PhD at the University of Bath, I wasn't really into this kind of open data movement, open access thing. And then I tried to do my research, and my research, like Sarah was saying, was on reusing other people's data, trying to piece them back together. And I discovered how incredibly hard it was to actually reuse published materials, published data. And I was really frustrated about this. So the very next conference I went to, I made a big talk. I just scrapped what I was going to say, just got on stage and went on a big rant about how we should be publishing data. Because at the moment, a lot of papers I see in the field of paleontology are basically effectively read-only. They're there as executive summaries of what research was done, but there's no actual reusable components there. And we live in the digital age. Research is digital. You can't submit manuscripts anymore, handwritten or written on typesetter. Everyone submits them via a computer. We do statistical analyses via a computer. This isn't hand done anymore. We have the data, but for some reason, when we come to publishing it, which I'd be interested to hear from the publisher side of things who are here today, that the data doesn't quite get published in useful forms. And so that's how I got into it. There was a Nature News article about what I was trying to do, and then from that, the Open Knowledge Foundation got in contact with me and invited me over to their conference. And I've subsequently become a Panton Fellow. So if you're an early career researcher and really interested in open data and how it affects your discipline, I'd really encourage you to look at the Panton Fellowships funding scheme. They give you funding to try and improve the open data scene in your community. That'll be opening up in March next year for the next round of funding. And yeah, I just think open data is a huge problem in academia. Not only the technical aspects of making data open, but also the legal aspects, licensing. Licensing of research data is key, and yet 95% of the academics I encounter in my sphere, to be honest, don't know enough about licensing, particularly licensing digital materials. And there's this kind of generational clash between digital academia and traditional non-digital academia, and it's two worlds have collided in a kind of unfortunate way. And so we kind of need to modernize the process of research to make data reusable.
Okay, so one of the things that, again, another straw poll, I wanted to find out, so how many people have been to a Science Online or Spot On conference meeting thing before? Quite a lot. Oh no, not so many actually. But then, so one of the frustrating things is that a lot of these talks can be echo chambers, and who here thinks that all research outputs should be made available online in appropriate linked data formats and what have you? So everybody. So we're preaching to the choir. But so the question I'd have for everybody here, there's a lot of academics here. If we're all going to say that we think this is a great idea and we're all going to talk the talk, who actually walks the walk, and who hasn't or wouldn't make their data available, and what are the reasons behind it? So would you like mine?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm now in libraries, but I come from chemistry where, this gets back to what you were saying about legal questions, but I think one of the reluctance in our discipline, we had a discussion at one of the Sonics a while ago that was really talking about there are fields for which this makes a lot of sense, and there are fields in which this doesn't make as much sense. And chemistry is one of the fields where it doesn't make as much sense for everything across the board. And a lot of that has to do with either patent law or with proprietary information, or if you're then going to sell that to a company to make some proprietary thing, you may not want to put out exactly how you did it.
But doesn't that depend on who it's funded by? I mean, if it's funded by a pharmaceutical company, then sure, the data can be kept private in some instances. But if it's publicly funded, does everyone here agree that it's publicly funded research? It should be open data.
Yeah.
Does anyone disagree with that? I'd be interested if anyone disagreed with that.
Actually, in that same field, I would. I've seen publicly funded activities or that would have led to drugs that would have reached the market that never made it.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's at the back there, someone disagree?
Yeah, to some extent at least. I come from a biology background, molecular cellular biology, and I think the problem that I would have with data being made freely available in my field is simply an issue of quality control. So, I mean, just because it's out there doesn't necessarily mean that you can trust it also.
Yes, quality control is a big issue, and that's why NERC funds the data centres, because NERC is effectively saying that to get your data into a data centre isn't as easy as it would be to just sticking it up on a web page somewhere. But at least if you can find a data set in a data centre, then you can be guaranteed that, okay, yes, they're going to be in a standard format, they're going to have a set amount of metadata. That means you've got a good chance of actually figuring out what the data set is all about. So I think at the minute we're still struggling to kind of figure out, well, there's obviously different gradations of making your data available. You can shove it on a web page, or you can put it in an archive, or you could publish it in a data journal or whatever. And each of those things will have a different level of trust associated with it. And I think we're still trying to figure out how exactly that's all going to work.
I mean, you could use the example of archive there as well that physicists use, in that, there hasn't been any problems with, no major problems with quality control at archive, and they have a similar thing that you can just upload stuff, basically there's a little thin layer at the beginning apart from that.
But it's easier to read a plain text journal paper than it is to open up a file and figure out whether it's binary coded ASCII or Excel or whatever the hell it is.
Yeah, so there needs to be that metadata around it. And the other thing there is I saw a guy from the NSF talk, and he was explaining to the audience, why they have changed that they're going to be measuring products instead of publications now. And somebody in the audience, an academic, said, why should I? If I'm going to be uploading stuff and I have to spend a lot of time adding all this extra, context to it and what have you. And he just said, well, I paid for it, so you have to do it. It's your job. But there's a lot of hands, so jump in.
I was going to say I'm from GLOS, and a big problem we have is, again, as you said, it's quite community specific, and a big one we have is ecology. Ecologists try and share things. Mainly because it takes them like 2 years to gather it, and they just say, sorry, it took me all this time, I'm not going to do it, just have you put plus one thing. And so there has to be some kind of, I think there has to be some kind of rules of saying that you have this long in which to kind of hold on to it, like they do with GTX.
Well, NERC actually have their data policy, which says that embargo periods are now limited to, I think it's 2 years. But yeah, I can understand. We work with ecologists, and I can understand why they're reluctant to share data when you spend 2 years of your life pouring your heart and soul into collecting it. Yeah. So I think what we need to do is a scientific culture change where data is considered to be as valuable, if not more valuable, than a peer-reviewed publication. And that's going to be quite tricky, but I think we can and will do it.
So is everyone in agreement that the only way to do that is funders mandating?
It has to be. No, it has to be multiple prongs.
It's not the only way.
No,
but funder mandates will definitely help.
Will it ever get done without funder mandates?
You need carrots as well as sticks.
Yeah.
Or a sufficiently big carrot that you can use as a stick.
So, Neil,
can I ask a devil's advocate question? So,
please do.
So I'm having a little conceptual issue here in that when I think of myself, I do want to make my data and all of my things reusable, but I want to make them reusable in different ways. So at the first level, I want to make sure they're reusable by me. At the second level, I want to make sure that they're reusable by the people that I work with on a close basis. And then at some point, there are certain outputs I want to make open access. So my question is, can either someone from the open access community convince me that actually you need to go for open access to solve the reuse problem? Or can someone convince me that actually my way of thinking that reuse and open access are two separate things that we both need to tackle, and we need to tackle them both, is the case? So are they intrinsically linked or are they not? Is this session talking about reuse or open access?
Josh is
going
to comment on that.
I'm going to echo that point because it's actually something that I've come to believe pretty strongly that one strategy going forward is to focus on reuse locally by one's own group, by immediate colleagues, based on existing relationships, and hammer out a process for making that much more frictionless and easy and robust and track provenance and all that kind of stuff, and then turn the open access into a purely policy decision. Because right now, it conflates both the kind of technical stuff that's really hard to invest, it takes a lot of work to invest in description and everything else, and we're not capturing good stuff along the way, so it all's backloaded toward the end of the process and the deposit. So there's a very high wall that you have to scale at the point of depositing data. And that often is a way for people to sort of say, it's really hard, I don't want to, and they conflate the policy and the sort of economics of sharing a lot of things with the just pragmatics of doing it. So there is an argument that focusing on making it a lot easier for to reuse your own data locally, while letting the people who want to sort of, I always think of the game Hearts, where you try to minimize the number of hearts in your hand, unless you try to capture them all and then you shoot the moon and then you win. The people who want to shoot the moon and try to make a career based on sharing data can, but in the near term, reducing the friction for everybody is a strategy forward.
And so that would be as well kind of not making everything open, but having access control on everything. Just allowing people to choose their own level of access.
Yeah, and then put pressure down the road on changing the norms of those decisions.
The problem with that is that what makes it so hard to make it open is also what makes it so hard to make it really reusable if you want to integrate it with others on stage. I mean, you mentioned the descriptions there that people hate to do. That's true. Right? But if we don't get the right description, that's not only the right one for you, that's also the one that matches the other one. You're not going to do that integration of like your data sets.
Okay.
Kind of an almost in between thing, but might be sorry, this is a very badly phrased. I think it's important to be able to have first dibs on your own data to some extent, but also there's not very much, at least in fields that are related to mine, there's not very much of a culture of requesting raw data and being willing to share it, as in which case you would maintain control of where your data is going and what it's being used for. But that simply just isn't part of the cultural mindset in a biological society.
Well, our policy is that if people need to make their data available on the web, because they're actually at the moment we might change, but yeah, at the moment we ask that people, if they're publishing content, they have to make the data available and give answer it.
Could I ask for every bit of data that's ever been published in PLOS?
Yeah, you have to go through every single author.
Okay.
There are research investigations that show that requesting data from primary authors is inefficient and ineffective. But the other thing that I think needs to be said is that researchers shouldn't be expected to publish all the data that they ever collect, all 9 gigabytes of it, terabytes or whatever it was. I have a colleague in Oxford who's an electron microscopist, one of the finest I know, and he reckons that for every 1,000 micrographs he creates, 100 are worth saving and publishing, potentially. 10 are the things that he looks at to put into papers, and a subset of that actually get published, and to have tools and facilities to make access, not the 1,000, but the 100.
The 100, yeah.
So within our data flow project in Oxford, we've been trying to create tools that allow researchers to manage their data locally in an easier way, so that they pay attention to it and so on. And it's not lost on the hard drive of a departed postdoc or on some dusty shelf somewhere on a CD. But then they, when they're ready, can select what they want to publish and package it in a very easy way and submit it to our local repository.
So that's a good point, actually. This is a tools session, and I know Ross has been doing some really cool stuff with trying to fix this problem going backwards, and so there's the Dataflow project. If anybody knows of any good tools or community projects that they'd like to mention, please feel free to shout about them. I don't know if you want to show your...
Yeah, if you could change tabs. So I'm working with Peter Murray Rust, who's at Cambridge, and he's a chemoinformaticist. And what we're working on is something called open content mining. So we've got this software tool called AMI2, and if you just Google like PMR blog, you'll probably find it because he's got quite a high Google rank. And basically, it's just open source software tools to hack PDFs apart. So the problem I had in my research was phylogenetics. Is the main data output of a phylogenetics paper is a tree, and this tree is 99 out of 100 times only provided as an image. So it's like data, but it's provided as an image. So when you're trying to reuse that image and you're trying to reuse it back in data form, all you've got is an image. So what we're doing is hacking apart the PDF, extracting that image in its vector graphics form, and trying to actually get it back into machine reusable data. But there's loads of different things you can do with this. And so if anyone's interested in actually extracting data back from scatter plots. Think of all those scatter plots that are buried in PDFs as images at the moment. There's no underlying data in any supplementary information, any Figshare or Dryad or any database. There's like trillions and trillions of dark data points out there. And I think this is a really cool project, all being done in the open, coordinated by the Open Knowledge Foundation. And so if you're interested in getting back data, you might want to have a look at that. Does that sound like a cool idea to everyone? Has anyone else got any kind of applications to use that for? I mean, I do meta-analysis, so I know it's immensely valuable to actually have data, even from very small empirical papers. Every data point counts. You know, it's not just like, oh, you only need to store the big analyses. You need to store everything.
But the other thing to emphasize is the link between the data and the paper, because the paper describes the conceptual framework in which you can make sense of the data.
Yeah, the context, yeah.
There's something that's going on in that space as well. I spoke to Jeff Builder recently about, because if you have objects that have, say, DOIs or handles, and there's no real ontology between, say, DataCite and Crossref for linking a paper that's got a Crossref DOI to something that's got a DataCite DOI. So that's moving forwards, and it's the same. I think Ross's example here was showing us that, you know, PDF is, everyone agrees, again preaching to the choir, an odd format to be publishing academic outputs.
It's great for reading, but it's terrible for reusing. It's a read-only object, and we're so focused upon PDFs now, and I don't know, it's useful.
The other tool to point out for PDFs then is the Utopia Documents project,
Utopia Docs is great,
which allows you to do secondary annotation over PDFs, so you don't have to touch the copyright PDF that you might not have rights to do, but you can make annotations over that, share them with the rest of the community, and they're available for everybody. And Steve Pettifer, who's developed that, has good PDF text mining tools too to get references out and things like that.
Martin, do you want?
Well, I sort of, when I heard your description, I sort of wasn't sure whether I should say this is a really cool project. Why should we do this in the first place? Because it's so painful and
I know, it's so ridiculous.
And of course, it's necessary now. But I think to say that maybe TIFF it's not a good format for figures in papers, and just have something SVG.
Yeah, everything's got to be.
Nobody does that.
Vector graphics.
Would go like a long way of making.
And the publishers and editors have got to enforce this. At the moment, you know, publishers kind of like these raster images because they're easy to deal with, is what I infer. And so, you know, although they suggest in their editorial guidelines, if someone submits, you know, a poor quality image figure, you often see it, even in 2012 papers, in very good high quality publishers who I won't name, but you see it in all sorts of different publishers. You see a really poor figure that is clearly a raster pixelated image, and you just wonder, how is that allowed? We need to actually enforce a certain minimum standard, and I hope that doesn't exclude some scholars, and it shouldn't, because there are free and open source tools to do vector graphics, and I shouldn't think it should be a financial problem. It's more a science problem, particularly in my area where people make composite figures. They try and load on, because of certain journals who publish a paper copy, unfortunately restrict the number of papers, the number of figures you can have. Now that actually has a negative effect upon the reusability of the science, because that means everyone's trying to cram together 6 plots in one figure. So instead of doing one figure in R and as an SVG, so it's all nice and reusable if you hack the PDF apart, then what they'll do is they'll do one figure in R, another figure in R, another figure in R, and then open up Adobe Illustrator or something, compose them all in a thing, add a few pretty pictures to make it even prettier, and then save it back down as like a bitmap or something, and then submit that to the journal. And that's really where paper journals are really causing constraints upon digital research. They're actually quite negative in terms of reusability. I think that's a big problem we've got to solve.
Yeah, going further from that, really, the publishers should release or publish the full XML.
Yes.
What you're trying to do,
I can't believe the number of journals that don't have XML. It's incredible. I mean, it's only biomedical journals and certain fields, like for kind of biodiversity informatics journals and kind of paleontological journals, XML is unheard of.
They all have, I'm a typesetter.
Yeah.
So
within the process, within house, yeah, they have XML, and they could expose that, yeah.
So we deliver XML.
Yeah.
All kinds of XML, good XML, with MathML,
yeah,
SVG, whatever you like.
Really good stuff.
But it goes into a vault somewhere.
Yeah.
And very few publishers who actually release that. So you have to come along and do this. Madness of reverse engineering.
Yeah,
yes. This PDF, which was invented 25 years ago, so you couldn't change it. It's just
So in terms of actionable points, could all the publishers in the room go back and tell, I like the comment from Martin, suggesting problems with the publisher process, working for a publisher yourself, So if everybody goes back and
PLOS is the shining example.
Yeah, they do XML,
they I think it's even worse that not only is it required, I mean, the requirement is sort of the next step, but even if you submit a manuscript with SVG, it's sort of not accepted in many places.
Yeah,
so so even if you do the extra step, it's just lost. And that.
How about we take it a step further back, though, in order to make the science that we submit more reusable? I mean, I know biologists tend to be pretty awful at this. We all use Microsoft Word as the authoring tool for our science. And actually, if we use something like LaTeX or something else, or a direct XML authoring tool, and just say, if you want to do science, if you want to publish science, you have to publish through this mechanism. Wouldn't that be great? I mean, that would reduce publication time. It would be technically quite difficult.
Barrier to entry.
Big high barrier to entry. But
yeah, I completely disagree with that. I think that in the pursuit of scientific research, you should use the tools that get you to the point of scientific innovation fastest. The question we have here is, should we mandate it that at the submission of our thing to our publisher that we must put it into LaTeX or into some XML format? I think that's the really interesting question. Would publishers go with something that said, at the point of submission where you want to get published, you have to conform to this format that is much easier to reuse, to mine, and so on?
And I think there are added bonuses there, because I think that would reduce publication times, because you'd have less, retypesetting when people get sent a Microsoft Word manuscript, and you'd also potentially have less error in there, introduced from this typesetting process, and it would be cheaper as well, potentially.
Who here as academics wouldn't know how to do that, though?
But the fact is, most publishers that I know of, especially the big ones, actually don't like LaTeX at all. I mean, in most cases, you're actually forced to use Word, even if you wrote it.
Yeah, it's true.
So I went through the process of just rewriting it in Word at the end.
Yeah, I think this is putting the emphasis at the wrong point. The researchers should be free to use whatever they're comfortable with. And it's the publishers who have stuff marked up in XML who should make that available.
Yeah.
I'm finding it interesting, though, that we're talking about putting data into a paper, which then we extract the data out again. Hang on, there's something not quite right with this. Surely we can publish the data in a way that you don't have to put it into PDF and take it out again. And I know that various people are in fact working on this. So the example that I know intimately is the Geoscience Data Journal, which has recently been launched by Wiley-Blackwell, where you have your data set in an approved repository. And an approved repository is someone who can issue a DOI at the minute. And then you write a couple of pages of paper saying, this is my data set, this is how I got my data set. You can have associated XML gubbins associated with the paper and then you will also have associated metadata with the data set itself. And then you publish the whole lot. You publish the paper has a citation linking it back to the data set, and there you go. So there's no need to kind of be fiddling around with PDFs. You can go to the data paper if you need to get a bit more of the background, a bit more of the story about how the data set was created. But at the same stage, you could also ignore the data paper completely, because in theory, at least, all the metadata to the data set should provide you enough information to use it.
Is that peer reviewed?
Yes.
So, because obviously, as you said, QC is a big issue. People just dumping data sets that you have no idea of whether.
No, the entire point is that there's kind of two levels of peer review. So we've got the scientific peer review, which is an actual scientist gets the data paper, gets the link to the data set, and they go and have a poke around. But it's made, because peer review of data is really quite difficult. That scientific peer review is made somewhat easier by the fact that if it's we know the data set is in an approved repository, so there won't be any problems for the scientific reviewer coming along and going, actually, I don't know what file format this is. I can't understand what the data set actually is. There's no metadata supporting it. Those issues won't be there if it's in an approved repository.
I'm glad you mentioned peer review, though, because something I sense from having actually reused and reanalyzed previously published data sets is that I sense that very few people are actually reviewing data. When they get a paper to review, they read the paper, they find the spelling mistakes, they find the errors of logic, but if someone's actually done something wrong with the data or has got some erroneous data, they never find that. And I think if we're going to be talking about data reuse, perhaps we can touch on the issue of reproducibility and actually reviewing data and making it easier technically to review data. What are people's thoughts on this?
This is an issue. Okay, so this is a JISC-funded project called Prepared. And we are actually going to be running a workshop in London in the British Library in April or May next year to discuss this very issue on how you go about peer reviewing data sets. So if you're interested, give me a shout.
So I'll flag one thing. At the Sloan Foundation, one of the projects we funded is a guy named Eric Kanza, who's out of Berkeley, and helps to run an archive of zooarchaeological data called Open Context. And they were interested in the question of data publication. And so they started off by saying, okay, what we're going to do is wire the Open Journal Systems review logic together with Google Refine and think about an interesting way to do this. And it turned out it failed. It fell flat on its face. And their conclusion was that we actually need different models for reviewing data. What they wound up coming up with, that is actually really cool, I'll tweet out a link to it, was actually saying that the review workflow and the way you approach reading an article and then file comments about that article didn't map to data. They actually wound up reworking their plan and writing a plugin for Mantis, the open source bug tracker, to work with Google Refine, and then basically file tickets with data sets that then can be resolved. And that notion of essentially bug reporting seems to map very nicely to the way we think about data, and you can think about who files those tickets, and you can think about who they're assigned to. So I'll tweet out a link to that. It's an interesting take on this.
Yeah. I'm trying to think where to go to next.
Do you think it would be feasible to actually have a third specialized data reviewer? So there's this journal called Biostatistics, and they have this guy called Roger Payne, who's quite big in the reproducibility crowd, and basically he wrote in an article in about 2009 to the journal saying, yeah, 18 out of 20 of the articles in the last volume were statistically wrong. Yeah, and so they said, fine, okay, you can be our data editor from now, and he has to go through each of the data sets and check them. But I mean, I actually think that's actually not such a bad idea, because modern day science is incredibly complex, an incredible different amount of analyses. And I think you may need like some people to read the paper, some people to look at the figures, and some people to actually look at the data. And do you think having data reviewers like Biostatistics does, and also Organic Syntheses is a chemistry journal where you have to get 2 independent people to actually redo the chemical experiment in order for the paper to be published. Do we think these kind of reproducibility initiatives will take off?
The International Union of Crystallography also has an interesting approach to reviewing the data, because the data is sort of integral to paper, and then that flags up sort of errors in the data, and that can be part of the thing. So there's an automatic element to that.
Yeah. But whenever I raise this conferences I go to, they just say, oh, it's too much effort, too much work. Reviewers already have a big workload, and we already can't find enough reviewers. Well, I actually think there's a little bit of a crisis happening in terms of data, because everyone's looking at the words and finding the spelling mistakes in papers. They're not actually finding the big, crucial statistical errors and data errors.
There's also a timing issue. I mean, people submit their papers to places that have a quick turnaround time, and reviewing data takes a lot longer. I would think, depending on the type of data, but it can take longer than reviewing the paper.
Well, like I said, it depends. If you have a two-tier review process where you only submit your paper after your data has been put into a trusted archive, then in theory all the scientific reviewer needs to go and do is have a look at a few quick look plots and maybe play around with it in some statistical programs or something.
So redo the analyses, basically. So if people could actually provide not just the data, but the kind of code that was used around it. Say it was an R analysis, the actual, statistics you did it, and the exact code you used on it. It should be just a click of a button, and it would take 3 seconds for a lot of papers. I mean, there are some papers where the computational part of it, is months on a cluster. But actually, the majority of the empirical papers that I look at, the actual analyses take seconds to replicate, as long as you have the data and the methods in the right format. At the moment, we have method sections that are extremely wordy, and they, in human readable words, they write out what the method is, but computationally, it's completely useless. I'd actually like to see a completely computational, machine readable methods section. I think that would be great in terms of the statistics that are done on the paper.
So we're kind of saying that in order to encourage data reuse, we also need to encourage sharing of code that's used.
Yes, the two go hand in hand, definitely.
Well, I'd say it's not even just data. I mean, what is data? It's not just spreadsheet data, it's the outputs of your research is what should be and could be reused. I was going to ask a question, but we've got a question.
I have another question first. I noticed there were a couple of people who are librarians who raised their hands, which is interesting. Do people here see the need for retrospective data analysis, so bringing things that are in legacy formats up to modern code, up to modern specs, so that then they can be used? So I'm thinking of a colleague of mine who did work on tariffs and had to go to all of these books that list all of these. I mean, this is what libraries used to do, right? Is books and books and books of data. So is anybody thinking about bringing that into the 21st century? Is that a concern for anybody here?
I think that's a counsel of perfection, and I wish it could occur, but I was looking at my shelves the other day, and I've got boxes and boxes of electron micrographs there in analog format. And I know I will never get funded to digitize those and put them online in a way that in the ideal world would happen. I think we have to start with where we are and get the data being created today published first. And then we can think about the back issues, just as journal publishers went online and then later, 10 years later, talked about their back collection.
I don't know. I think some things, like some of the collections at Kew are being digitised, and I think that's really, really useful for taxonomic data, because that's still relevant today. It's not just new data in that sense. It's data that, and then you open that up to such a wide range of people that currently can't go to Kew and do it. So I think that's really important.
In the last section we were talking, it was the tool section. It was mentioned the Open Weather project, which is sort of that crowdsourcing digitization of weather logs from all the boats, and it's kind of like there's people out there that will spend 1 minute or like 24 hours just typing in numbers and it's all data, but It's really useful for current environment.
We talked about, sorry, about the format, what format they no one's mentioned. If we want data to be say peer reviewed or used in future, really it should be in an open format.
Yeah.
Right.
That's one thing.
Is there any?
That's one thing we're looking at doing with Figshare. So if you upload an Excel file, it should be available as a CSV or in open format. So there's lots of things that can be converted on the fly. It's just getting the data to begin with in any format. It seems to be the interesting part. And this kind of ties into the question I was going to ask, that in terms of reuse and getting people incentivized to share their data in the first time so that we can reuse it, is data papers the solution, in that you have the paper structure, like you were suggesting with the example you gave, and there's a few new journals coming out like this, and is that the future? Is that good enough for everybody?
No.
Okay.
Okay. I'm gonna nail my colours to the mast here, and I'm gonna say that until research achievement is predicated on something other than publishing in high impact journals, then we're stuffed. We've got to kind of shoehorn data in and treat it as if it was a journal paper. We've got to shoehorn code in and treat it as if it was a journal paper. The ideal situation is we come up with different methods for quantifying how important and how impactful, the awful word, but there you go, how important and how much of an impact our research actually does, without having to use the proxy of how many times a paper is cited.
Yeah, such as Altmetrics.
Yeah.
Which is in another room after this, if you like.
I just want to answer as a librarian about the question about digitising the book's worth of analogue data. Probably somebody published that and they own copyright to it, and that is a problem for libraries if we were to undertake such a project.
I'm thinking of things, that are either in Happy Trust or that are already openly put out.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a good way to test some of the techniques that we
And I think certainly from University of Warwick we have an archive that's part of our library services, and we are digitising really old stuff, but it is really old because then it's out of copyright and it's primary sources for historians rather than
It goes back to the question earlier that was the distinction between open access and data reuse, right?
Yeah.
I know a lot of graduate students who spend a lot of time in some of those books, putting them into a format that they can use now.
Yeah,
because
I've done
they
that.
weren't published on CD at the time, and they weren't published in any way that they can use. So to split out those two questions, a lot of people in our libraries do spend a lot of time dealing with the copyrighted material just to get it into a format so they can use it.
but they can do that under the copyright law for their own use, but
Right.
they can't share it.
Well, that's why I'm saying to split out the question of sharing from the question of reformatting, which, yeah. And this is what libraries deal with for people who don't know. I mean, these are like in the wheelhouse of libraries, and people are trying to address.
I want to get back to data journals and data citation as a strategy. And I think data citation is something that sort of has become a standard, that you have DOIs for data, and citation looks similar, but I think it doesn't quite work. Michael, who sits next to me, has shown some nice data.
People aren't citing data
People aren't
because it's
citing
not, because people don't cite data.
So I
It's
think-
kind of, we need to kind of convince people.
And when they try and do it, they get it wrong. So the stuff I've seen is they cite, oh yeah, the data's in Dryad. They don't give the DOI, they don't, put the authors, it's kind of...
That's an education problem.
Yeah, but we still need to get that education out. To me, I look at that and it's obvious, and it's really clearly given on the Dryad website how you should cite this data, and they still ignore it.
So, but my point was more, of course, making a plug for the Altmetrics session, but maybe citation is not the right measure of reuse for data. Maybe it's something else, whether it's simply usage or whether it's something else.
I think
just the citation counting is just using a model that works for publication and applying it.
I think we're being a bit naive here, because the reality for most data is that usage is in the long tail. Most of the data that we're producing, you may be talking to about 5 people in the world. Now, I think what we need to get over is the fact that that's okay. So the half-life of a lot of this data is often going to be very, very long. So we've got to find that metric that basically embodies things like half-life, so that we can then sort of feel better about this.
The thing that we've got to remember, though, is that researchers even though they're pushing back the boundaries of science and all the rest of it, they tend to be pretty conservative. And altmetrics, people start looking at a bit funny, like, oh, okay, there's not enough momentum here, and there's not enough people going, altmetrics are important. My funding agency don't think that altmetrics are important. The RAE doesn't think that altmetrics are important. What's important to them, and therefore my university or my research organisation, is citations. So yes, data citation might not be the ideal way of dealing with data, but it's one step closer to having data treated like it's supposed to be, like a first-class research.
And it is something we can count. If
Yeah.
people do cite it in a way that, any structured way, that's easy to count the citations to it from traditional papers. Yeah.
And I think
to understand what those mean.
I think we can get people to cite data properly, but we need a multiple-pronged approach. We need researchers telling other researchers, this is how you cite my data. We need the journals saying, this is how you cite data. We need the funders saying, you must cite data.
And librarians.
And the librarians
training
training. Yes, everybody needs to go out and tell everybody else, you must cite data. So that's, all right, that's your task for
That's
today.
another action point. I like
Yeah,
it.
go forth and cite data.
I'd like to plug this paper, which I've just got on board. Recently released open access paper in
Can you
BSc
pronounce
Research
his
Notes.
name?
Well, sorry?
Can you pronounce his name?
No, it's ENH. That's how you say it.
Only Ian can pronounce it.
Excellent paper. One of the main barriers I find of reusing data is simply the legal barrier. Not even the like kind of physical paper, kind of old legacy data. We need to make sure that if we're going to fix this problem for data reuse, we actually need to get the licensing right. And CC0 where possible, and if not, perhaps we should talk about discussions now, exceptions to CC0 for data licensing. Well, what are valid exceptions?
To CC0 for
Yeah,
data.
so obviously like sensitive patient data, making data open as well, maybe not just CC0, but making data openly available on the internet.
Photos, which are classically regarded as creative works and are subject to copyright, I think is a good example of exception.
Yeah, so but they could be made. What license would you use then?
We use CC BY for that.
Okay.
This is interesting. If we're saying go forth and cite data, and then use CC0, so nobody needs to cite
Well,
data.
no. The thing is that you're still citing it, but you're not legally required
and the
to.
social norms.
Yeah, they're two separate.
There's no legal requirement to cite someone else's paper when you write a paper. It's the societal norms of science that create that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's exactly the same for data citations. We should use the data cite format for citing data, as you just said. We should use the appropriate licenses, but we should cite it not because we're legally obliged to, but because that's the way science works.
So the one area, though, where we probably cite enormous amounts of data all the time is one area where we don't do attribution, and of course that's sequence data, where we're all busy putting our GenBank numbers in, but there's no authors involved.
When you go back to the GenBank number, can you not see where the author is?
Yes, you can, but of course it doesn't necessarily, you can't kind of compute how valuable that sequence is. Who's put the most valuable sequence in GenBank? That's not a computable question. It is an answerable question.
I could do that.
Yeah. you have, but there's no.
It's not immediately answerable.
No, you basically have to write a script to crawl GenBank to do that.
Yeah.
You couldn't go to NCBI and query it.
Yeah.
So, with 10 minutes to go, has anybody got any burning questions, or is anyone actually going to do anything after leaving this session and take on board any extra points? Al?
I'd just like to mention the different tools that I use for sharing data, which is putting files in a folder on the internet. Google Drive makes this quite easy. You put your files in a folder, you can get them from anywhere.
How do you make that discoverable, though?
There's a button you can use to share the data with the rest of your group, and there's a button you can press to share it with anyone on the web. And there's a button you can use to tell people who are interested in what you're doing about that on Google.
But how do I find that? I mean, I work at quite a high level of meta-analysis, so I get really pissed off actually when people say, oh, the data's on their lab website. Because A, their name is like Martin Smith, and there's loads of Martin Smiths in the world. B, I'm looking for like any phylogeny analysis ever published. So lots of kind of like people interested in paleo fish share all their data with the paleo fish people and think, oh, well, that's the only people in the world that would ever use paleo fish data. It isn't. There are people that are interested in quite high-level kind of meta-analyses who may not be able to discover these kind of local networks of sharing.
You're on librarians' territory again. That's the difference between stuff that's accessible and stuff that's discoverable.
Yeah. And then that's what things like Figshare do, and kind of tagging and metadata actually makes things discoverable, and that's why we really shouldn't be encouraging researchers to put their data on a lab website,
I
because
think that's an extra layer of curation on top of actually just sharing the data in the first place.
but you don't have to do that as a researcher. You don't have to do that curation. Once you put it in a professional data repository, they'll do that curation for you, hopefully. Fingers crossed.
And that kind of ties back into what Neil was saying before about, you know, there's different levels of reuse. So that is a good solution for the first level of reuse, which is sharing it with people, you know, your local community. But there's different levels that need to be targeted in different ways so Ross can find your data.
You should be paying for data curation. You should be paying for putting it over it.
Research funders.
No, the people who paid to actually create it in the first place.
Yeah.
And you think that happens adequately at the moment?
No. No, but then I'm kind of contractually obliged to say that. They're working on it though, at least in Merck's case.
Yeah, I think in NERC probably are, I'm not quite sure.
Same with BBSLC actually, because I've done written a BBSLC grant recently, and they do have a section where you can apply for, you know, costs specific to data infrastructure management. So it is kind of on the research funders, you know, radar, but maybe more could be done.
I think the problem is that researchers tend to see that any money set aside from the Research Council budget for data curation is money that could have been spent on doing proper science, and how dare they? I mean,
it's the same problem with open access. I mean, people see that as, you know, wasted money, that, oh, we could have spent this money making this paper open access, we could have spent that on actual research. But actually, you know, making the outputs of research accessible and reusable is very much part of research. It's not just about, you know, doing research. That's only one part of the process of science. So, yeah.
Well, I think with 5 minutes to go, that's a good place to kind of draw a line, so people can get to the next sessions. We did say that we were going to end with the fact that the badges, data is the new black, have ran out, and that's a good bit of science showing you that data is the new black, and thank you for everyone for joining in.